So in our last video, we gave you an update on how the secondary watch market has done so far in 2023. If you haven't already seen it, I'd recommend you check it out. I'll include a link in the description. Here, we'd like to tackle the question of whether by the time the year is up, the watch market will have done better or worse compared to all of 2022. All the numbers in this video come from WatchCharts.com. I'll throw up our usual disclaimer on the screen, but I'm very anxious to just sort of get into the actual analysis. So let's get started. And so the way we're going to try and tackle this question is by looking at brand indexes for a few different brands. We'll tell you when their peak occurred for their respective indexes in 2022, what the delta was from that peak to the end of the year. And so that gives you a sense of how far they fell. But then also we'll show you the delta for the full year, so from the start of the year to the end of the year, because the peak was actually in March to April, depending on the brand. And then we'll also give you what the delta year to date this year in 2023 is. And then based on how that's going, I'm calling the 2023 end of year dumb prediction is what we'll include as an indication of where we think things might go. But there's a bunch of assumptions that are necessary to point out in terms of making this prediction, because anything forward looking, of course, is going to be speculative. And so we can make some sort of educated guess based on what we understand about how the market is moving. But of course, at the end of the day, no one really knows what the market may do. And so that's just something to keep in mind. And we'll kick things off with actually looking at the brand that this year to date so far has lost the most, and then we'll work our way down that list depending on the delta year to date. And so the brand to have lost the most value this year is Audemars Piguet. In 2022, it lost from its peak just under 30% of its value. And then for the full year, it lost just over 12%. And this year, it's already lost roughly the same amount of value in percentage terms. Of course, in absolute terms, those numbers are going to be different, but that's sort of where we are with AP so far this year. And so if we just extrapolate that until the end of the year, given the current rate of decline, AP will end up losing about 19% of its index value, or will shed about 19% of its index value by the end of this year. We can add in the other brands in the Big Three, and then also Vacheron, luckily, ends up also just in the way that this list is sorted. So let's look at those next. Patek, again, lost about 30%, but actually for the full year was only down about 6%. And so far this year, they've already beat that. They're already down 7.91%. And so if that continues unchanged on an unchanged path, then by the end of the year, they could lose 13%. Vacheron, from its peak last year, lost almost 19%, but for the full year was about flat. This year, they're down about 5.5%. And so if that continues, they could end up losing about a little over 9% of their index value by the end of the year. And then finally, Rolex, which also lost about 27-28% of its index value from its peak in 2022, which in Rolex's instance occurred on the 11th of March, 2022, for the full year lost just under 15% of the index value. And so far this year, that pace of decline has been relatively severely arrested. So it's only about 4% that they've lost this year so far. And if that trend continues, they'll end up losing about 6.5% this year, which is about half of what they lost last year. And so just to sort of fill out the rest of the picture, of course, with the Big Three, you get a sense of what the vast majority of the market is going to turn out to look like. But then just for some of the other brands on this list, these are some of the brands that are either collector favorites, enthusiast favorites, or happen to be in the list of the top 10 selling brands on the secondary market. So for Lange last year, the index appreciated about 13% in value, and so far this year, they're flat and might end the year about flat. But then there's also brands like Tag, Breitling, or Cartier, which didn't really have any sort of great movement in their index values over 2022, but then so far this year have appreciated a little bit. And if that trend continues, of course, they'll appreciate until the end of the year as well. But at this stage, given how small these brands are by market value, and then also how small they are in terms of the actual deltas here, essentially you could consider these to be brands that will stay flat. But let's zoom back into just these top four brands for a second, because there's this interesting question now, which is that given that we have these predictions, what I'm calling these dumb predictions, what we can actually do is, in a very straightforward way, answer the question that I asked at the start of the video, which is 2023 going to end up being worse than 2022? And so if we just go off of these predictions, then AP, Patek, and Vacheron are both going to end up being in a worse situation than Rolex. But of course, that's building in so many assumptions that it really is like very difficult to say sitting here in August what things might look like in December. But what are some of those assumptions? Let's go over those. The first one I want to talk about is the state of supply on the market. And we talked about this a little bit in more detail in the previous video, but here I think the point that I want to make is that based on the historical trend, the available supply on the market remains relatively elevated. And so as long as that continues to be the case, then consumers will continue to have options, which means that dealers will continue to have pressure to, bring prices down and be competitive. And until, I guess, some of that excess inventory, relatively excess inventory, is reabsorbed by customers back out of the market, it's difficult to see that prices would start appreciating in any meaningful way when there's so much choice available for the buyer. The second assumption is that there are no major hype releases left for the rest of the year. And so if we think about what the Moonswatch did for Omega last year, where they sold more than 1 million coming out of nowhere, or if we go back 5 years and look at the original Tudor Black Bay 58, which was literal unobtainium when it came out and remained that way for a good couple of years after its release. So far this year, there's nothing that is in the same category of knock your socks off, sort of blockbuster release from any brand. There are obviously watches that are worth mentioning that are interesting and represent innovations in all sorts of things from movement to design, but there's nothing that's sort of in the same category, certainly as I see it, as the Black Bay 58 or the Moonswatch. But then lastly, there's some new Rolex releases this year. They've refreshed, of course, the Daytona, which is by far the single most popular watch on the secondary market. They've also introduced now a wearable titanium watch in a 42mm Yachtmaster case and bracelet, which represents another very interesting value proposition or sort of aesthetic choice for customers interested in Rolex. And of course, because this is going to be in such high demand, because it is going to be so limited, depending on how far that hype goes, then these watches might carry the market, certainly for Rolex, into positive territory, depending on how many of these watches actually show up onto the secondary market and start getting traded. Of course, if that trend does hold true, then maybe Rolex won't lose as much value on its index as we measure it, as we are certainly at this stage in a very dumb way predicting. But this is sort of our data-driven way of making some claims about what we think, given what we understand about the market today, might happen for the rest of the year. But let us know in the comments what you think might change in the market between now and December 31st. And if there are any questions as well, we'll take a look at those and see what we can do to answer them in future videos. Thanks for listening.